Imagine a person you know who is very good at their job. Capable. Reliable. The kind of person other people turn to when something needs doing, because they can be trusted to do it. Now watch what happens to that person over the next 3 years. Because they say yes, they get asked more. Because they get asked more, they take on more. Because they take on more, their attention thins out, spread across a dozen commitments like a single pat of butter scraped over too much bread. And here is the cruel part. Nothing dramatic goes wrong. There is no disaster, no failure, no moment of collapse. They simply become slightly worse at everything. Their best work, the work that made them worth asking in the first place, quietly stops happening because there is no longer any room in their calendar where deep work could occur. They are busier than they have ever been and less consequential than they were 3 years ago. And if you asked them how they got there, they would not be able to point to a single decision. There was never a decision. There were 400 small yes, each of which seemed reasonable at the time. That drift is the subject of Greg McKeown's book Essentialism, The Disciplined Pursuit of Less, published in 2014. And McKeown's central claim is a strange one because it inverts something most of us take for granted. We tend to assume that being overextended is a symptom of a problem, something that happens to us because of a demanding boss, a growing company, a phone that will not stop. McKeown argues that being overextended is not something that happens to you. It is something you do, one default at a time, and the reason it feels like it is happening to you is that you have never actually made the choice consciously. You have been letting other people make it for you, and then experiencing the results as weather. What I find worth sitting with in this book is not the productivity advice, which is fine but not unique. It is the underlying diagnosis, which is genuinely uncomfortable. McKeown is suggesting that the busy, exhausted, spread-thin life is not a moral failure of weakness and not a structural failure of the modern economy. It is a failure of nerve. It is what happens when you would rather be liked than be clear. Greg McKeown was born in Britain and later built his working life in California, in and around Silicon Valley. His background is in the world of management thinking and executive advising. He studied at Stanford, and his ideas circulated first in that ecosystem of consultants, business school seminars, and Harvard Business Review essays, before Essentialism turned them into a book that reached far past the corporate audience it was written for. The book was published in 2014, became a substantial bestseller, and has been translated into a long list of languages. McKeown followed it in 2021 with Effortless, a kind of companion volume asking a related question. Once you have identified the essential thing, how do you make doing it easier rather than harder? The context matters here, and I want to be honest about it because it shapes both the strengths and the limits of what you are about to hear. Essentialism is a book written by a man who advised senior executives for an audience that substantially consists of senior executives and people who aspire to be them. It emerged from a particular moment in a particular place, the American technology and management world of roughly 2005 to 2014, where the cultural water everyone was swimming in said that a talented, ambitious person should be able to have it all and do it all, and that any limit you encountered was a limit in yourself. McKeown was pushing back against that specific ideology. He was arguing, to people who had been told their whole careers that capacity was infinite, that it is not. There is a personal story at the heart of the book that tells you why he cares about this, and I think it is the most important thing in the whole volume. McKeown's wife was in the hospital, having just given birth to their daughter. And on that day, McKeown left the hospital and went to a client meeting because a colleague had suggested it would look bad if he did not attend, and because he did not want to seem uncommitted. He went. The meeting accomplished nothing. The client, unsurprisingly, was not impressed that he had come. He had traded one of the irreplaceable days of his life for a room he did not need to be in, and he had traded it not because someone forced him but because he could not bring himself to say a clear no. The entire book is, in a sense, an argument he is having with the man who left that hospital. I mention this because it inoculates the book against a fair objection. It would be easy to hear the word essentialism and think this is a book about squeezing more output from your working hours, a kind of ruthless optimization. It is not. McKeown's argument runs the other way. The reason to strip away the non-essential is that the non-essential is currently eating the things you actually care about, and it is eating them so gradually and so plausibly that you will never notice the meal. The phrase McKeown builds everything on comes from the German industrial designer Dieter Rams, whose principle was, in translation, less but better. Not less for its own sake. Not minimalism as an aesthetic, not an empty desk, not a smaller wardrobe as a lifestyle statement. Less in service of better. The distinction is easy to miss, and it is the whole thing. Simply doing less is not essentialism, it is just underachievement, and you can be lazy and undisciplined and still have a very empty calendar. What McKeown is describing is a trade. You give up breadth in order to purchase depth. You accept that you will not be present at many rooms in order to be genuinely, consequentially present in a few. The energy that was previously divided into 14 streams, none of them strong enough to move anything, gets concentrated into 1 or 2 streams strong enough to cut rock. McKeown frames this as 2 different mental models, 2 different operating systems, running in different people. The non-essentialist thinks, I have to. It is all important. How do I fit it all in? The essentialist thinks, I choose to. Only a few things really matter. What are the trade-offs? And underneath those, McKeown identifies 3 core truths that the essentialist has internalized and the non-essentialist has not. The first is, I choose to, not I have to. This sounds like a slogan, and in weaker hands it would be one, but McKeown is making a real philosophical point. The moment you say I have to, you have handed your agency to someone else, and you have done it voluntarily. You almost never actually have to. You have to pay a price if you refuse, and sometimes that price is genuinely high, and refusing may be the wrong call. But the price is a fact about the world, and the choice is still yours. The non-essentialist has forgotten that the choice exists. And McKeown's observation is that this forgetting is a kind of learned helplessness. When you have been ignoring your ability to choose for long enough, the muscle atrophies, and eventually you cannot feel it at all. You experience your own calendar as something that arrives, like rain. The second truth is, only a few things really matter. This is the observation that outcomes in almost every domain are wildly unevenly distributed. A small number of your efforts produce most of your results. A small number of your relationships carry most of your happiness. A small number of the tasks on today's list will still matter in a year. And crucially, most of the rest are not just less valuable, they are approximately worthless, which means the arithmetic of removing them is not a painful sacrifice at all. It only feels painful because of loss aversion. The third truth is the one people resist hardest. You can do anything but not everything. Notice the shape of that sentence. It is not a limit on ambition, it is a limit on simultaneity. McKeown is not telling you that you cannot achieve the thing you want. He is telling you that you cannot achieve it while also doing 11 other things, and that the reason you have not achieved it is not that it was too hard, but that you never actually gave it a real attempt. Because you were too busy giving mediocre attempts to a dozen other things. Which brings us to trade-offs, which is where McKeown gets sharp. The non-essentialist asks, how can I do both? The essentialist asks, which problem do I want? Because the choice is not between a trade-off and no trade-off. The trade-off is going to happen whether you participate in it or not. Your only real decision is whether you make it deliberately, with your eyes open, or whether you let it happen to you by default while you tell yourself a comforting story about doing both. McKeown uses the airline industry to make this concrete, and the example holds up. Southwest Airlines, under Herb Kelleher, made a set of very unfashionable choices. No meals. No seat assignments. No first class. Point-to-point routes instead of the hub-and-spoke model everyone else used. Every one of those was a genuine loss, a real thing customers might want, given up on purpose. And the reason it worked is that those losses paid for something: low fares and fast turnarounds. When competitors tried to copy the model without accepting the trade-offs, launching budget subsidiaries that still offered the meals and the seat assignments and the hub connections, they got the worst of both worlds. They had not made a choice. They had made a gesture toward a choice, which is not the same thing, and the market found them out. That failure mode is the one worth transplanting into your own life. Most of us are not Southwest, and we are not the traditional carriers. We are the doomed hybrid, trying to have the low fares and the hot meal, refusing to name the trade-off, and quietly paying for that refusal in the only currency we have. Here is the idea in this book I find most genuinely useful, and it is not the productivity advice. McKeown describes what he calls the clarity paradox, and it runs in 4 phases. Phase 1, you have clarity of purpose. You know what you are trying to do. Phase 2, that clarity leads to success, because clarity is enormously effective and most people do not have it. Phase 3, your success brings you options and opportunities. This is what success is structurally. Success is the state of having more people want things from you. And Phase 4, those options and opportunities diffuse your efforts, which destroys the very clarity that produced the success in the first place. Sit with the shape of that. It means success is not a stable state you arrive at. It is a self-consuming state. The reward for doing one thing well is a flood of invitations to do other things badly, and the flood arrives disguised as validation. Every one of those invitations is flattering. Every one of them is evidence that you are doing well. And accepting them one by one, each for perfectly good reasons, is precisely how you dismantle the thing that got you here. McKeown connects this to Jim Collins's observation, in the work Behind Good to Great, that more companies die of indigestion than starvation. They do not fail because they lacked opportunities. They fail because they swallowed too many. And once you see this pattern, you cannot stop seeing it. The band whose first album was tight and specific and whose 4th album is a formless sprawl of everything they can now afford to do. The writer whose early work was hungry and precise and whose later work is bloated because no editor will say no to them anymore. The engineer who is brilliant at one thing, got promoted for it, and now attends meetings. The uncomfortable implication is that success requires more discipline than failure did, not less. When you are unknown, the world enforces your focus for you, because nobody is asking you for anything. There is nothing to say no to. The moment that changes, the enforcement disappears and you have to supply it yourself, at exactly the moment when saying no has become socially expensive and psychologically unnatural. Almost nobody makes that transition. That is why the pattern is so common. The most counterintuitive move in essentialism is that the process of doing less begins with exploring more, not less. This seems backwards. If you are trying to narrow, why widen? McKeown's answer is that you cannot select the vital few if you have not seen the trivial many. Discernment requires a field of comparison. If you only ever look at the 2 options in front of you, you will pick the better of 2 mediocre things, and you will never know that a 3rd option existed which was worth 10 of them. So the essentialist explores broadly and commits narrowly, while the non-essentialist does the reverse, exploring almost nothing and committing to nearly everything that wanders into view. And exploration requires conditions that modern working life is engineered to destroy. It requires space to think, which McKeown calls escape. Not a vacation, not a retreat, just protected, defended, non-negotiable time in which you are unavailable and doing nothing that produces output. He points to the practice of thinkers and executives who guarded solitary time as a hard commitment rather than a luxury they would get to when things calmed down. Things do not calm down. There is no version of the future in which you are less busy. The time either gets defended now or it does not exist. Exploration requires looking, and McKeown has a lovely illustration of what looking actually means. It comes by way of the writer Nora Ephron describing her high school journalism teacher. He gave the class a set of facts for a story. The principal announced that on Thursday, the entire faculty would travel to a seminar featuring named speakers and so on. The students dutifully wrote leads that rearranged those facts. And the teacher told them they had all missed it. The lead was, "There will be no school Thursday." The point is not cleverness. The point is that every student had processed the information and none of them had asked what it meant. They were so busy with the data that the meaning walked straight past them. That, McKeown suggests, is what most of us do with our own lives. We have all the facts about how we spend our days, and we have never once asked what they add up to. Exploration requires play, which McKeown, drawing on the research of Stuart Brown and the argument of Ken Robinson, defends as functionally essential rather than childish. Play broadens the range of options you can even conceive of, it counteracts stress, and it activates the parts of the brain that handle exploration and reward. The reason play gets cut first in a busy life is that it looks like the most obviously non-essential thing on the list. McKeown's argument is that this is a category error. Play is upstream of everything else. It is where the good ideas come from, and cutting it to make room for execution is like burning the seed corn to fuel the tractor. And exploration requires sleep, which is the chapter where McKeown is most straightforwardly right and most widely ignored. He draws on the research into elite performance, including Anders Ericsson's study of violinists, in which the very best players did not merely practice more deliberately, they also slept more, around 8.5 hours, and napped during the day. Sleep was not the thing they gave up in order to practice. It was part of the practice. McKeown pairs this with Bill Clinton's remark that every important mistake he made in his life, he made because he was too tired. The Essentialist treats sleep as an asset that raises the value of every waking hour, rather than a cost to be minimized. The non-essentialist treats sleep as the flexible budget line, the one place where more hours can always be found, and pays for those hours with judgment, which is the one resource they could least afford to spend. Now we come to the mechanism, and it is the most quotable idea in the book. McKeown calls it the 90% rule. When you evaluate an option, score it from 0 to 100 against your single most important criterion. If it scores anything below 90, you rewrite the score as 0 and you reject it. Not because a 70 is bad. Because a 70 is not good enough, and the whole game is refusing to spend your finite life on things that are not good enough. Why be this brutal? Because the 60s and 70s are where lives go to die. A truly terrible option is easy to refuse. Nobody agonizes over an offer that is obviously wrong. The dangerous options are the decent ones, the pretty good ones, the ones with real merit that you could plausibly justify, because those are the ones that fill your calendar without ever triggering a moment of resistance. Every one of them is defensible. Collectively, they are fatal. The 90% rule exists specifically to kill the plausible, because the implausible was never the problem. McKeown compresses this into a decision heuristic. If it is not a clear yes, then it is a clear no. Notice how that reallocates the burden of proof. Most of us treat maybe as leaning toward yes, and we require a positive reason to decline. The Essentialist treats maybe as no, and requires a positive reason to accept. That single inversion, applied consistently, would restructure most people's lives within a year. The rule also has a hidden prerequisite that people skip, and skipping it renders the whole thing useless. To score something against your most important criterion, you must have a most important criterion. Singular. If you have 5 criteria, everything scores well on at least one, and you have simply built a machine for justifying whatever you already wanted. The 90% rule is not a scoring technique. It is a forcing function that makes you admit what you actually value, and it is uncomfortable precisely because most of us have never done that and have organized our lives so that we never have to. Selection is the easy part because selection is conceptual. Elimination is where it hurts because elimination happens in front of other people. McKeown starts elimination with clarity, arguing that a team or a person without a clear essential intent will fill the vacuum with politics and busywork. He distinguishes essential intent from the other 3 things organizations produce. A vision or a mission is inspirational but vague, which means nobody can act on it. A quarterly objective is concrete but uninspiring, which means nobody wants to. Values are general and inspiring but unmeasurable. Essential intent is the rare 4th quadrant, concrete and inspirational, meaningful and measurable, so specific that you will know unambiguously when it has been achieved. The example McKeown gives is Martha Lane Fox, appointed as Britain's digital champion, who reduced a sprawling mandate to a single sentence, everyone in the United Kingdom online by the end of 2012. You cannot argue about what that means. You cannot fudge whether you have done it. That is the entire point. A goal you can fudge is a goal you will fudge. Then comes the no, and McKeown is honest that this is the hardest thing in the book, because the cost of saying no is immediate, social, and felt in your body, while the benefit is diffuse, future, and invisible. You feel the awkwardness in the room right now. You do not feel the 11 hours you just bought yourself next month. Human beings are not built to make that trade well. His practical move is to separate the decision from the relationship. The non-essentialist hears a request and processes it as a referendum on whether they are a good person, which makes refusal feel like a confession of inadequacy. The essentialist understands that you are declining a request, not rejecting a human being, and that the person asking is, in almost every case, far less invested in your answer than you imagine. He offers a set of graceful forms: the pause before answering, the no that includes a genuine alternative, the awkward but honest "let me check my calendar and get back to you," and the recognition that a slow yes is worse than a fast no for everyone involved, including the person asking. Above all, he offers the reframe that saying no is not a failure of generosity. Saying yes to everything is the failure of generosity, because it guarantees that everyone you said yes to receives a diminished, distracted, resentful fraction of you. But new commitments are only half the problem. The other half is the commitments you already have, which is where McKeown addresses the sunk cost trap. We keep doing things because we have already invested in them, and the investment feels like a reason to continue when it is in fact irrelevant. The money is gone. The years are gone. The only question that matters is whether this is worth your next hour, and the past has no vote. His tools here are practical. The reverse pilot: instead of piloting a new initiative, quietly stop doing an existing one and see whether anyone notices. Often nobody does, which tells you something devastating and liberating about the report you have been producing every month for 6 years. Zero-based budgeting applied to your commitments. Rather than justifying removals from an assumed baseline, assume nothing and justify each item's inclusion from scratch. And the killing question for endowment effect: if you did not already own this, how much would you pay to acquire it now? If the honest answer is nothing, then you are not keeping it because it is valuable. You are keeping it because letting go feels like losing, and feelings are not evidence. Then there is editing, which McKeown calls the invisible art, borrowing from film. A good edit is one you never notice. It does not announce itself. It simply produces a result that flows, and the audience never suspects how much was cut to make it flow. He cites Stephen King's rule of thumb that a second draft equals the first draft minus 10%, and extends it into a life principle. The cutting is not damage to the work, the cutting is the work. Everyone can add. Adding is easy, adding feels productive, adding is what busy people do all day. Subtraction is the skill, and it is rare because it is invisible, which means nobody will ever praise you for it. You will only be praised for what remains. Finally, boundaries. McKeown's insight here is that boundaries are not walls that keep other people out, they are the thing that makes freedom possible, in the same way that the rules of a game are what makes play possible rather than what constrains it. And he makes a point that lands hard: if you do not set boundaries, there will be none. Other people will not set them for you out of consideration, not because they are malicious, but because your available time is a free resource and free resources get consumed. That is not cruelty. That is physics. If you leave the tap open, do not be surprised that the water runs. The last section of the book is about making the essential happen with minimal friction, and this is where McKeown is at his most conventional, though still useful. He starts with buffers, and specifically with the planning fallacy, the extremely robust finding that human beings systematically underestimate how long things take, even when they have done the same thing many times before and been wrong every time. His prescription is to add 50% to your estimate as a matter of course. Not because you are bad at estimating, but because everyone is, permanently, and the correction has to be structural rather than a promise to try harder. The non-essentialist assumes the best case, and is therefore in a permanent state of emergency, because the best case is not the case. The essentialist builds in slack and consequently has capacity when the unexpected arrives, which it always does. Then subtraction, which draws on the theory of constraints. If you want a system to go faster, do not push harder everywhere. Find the single slowest point and remove the obstacle there. McKeown tells it through a scouting hike, where the group's speed was set entirely by its slowest walker, and no amount of the faster walkers walking faster changed the group's arrival time at all. The only intervention that worked was helping the slowest walker, by taking his pack. The transplant to your own work is direct and slightly humiliating. Ask what is the one obstacle actually preventing the essential thing from happening, and then notice that almost all of your effort is currently going somewhere else, into optimizations that cannot possibly matter because they are not the constraint. Then Progress, where he draws on the research of Teresa Amabile and Stephen Kramer, whose analysis of thousands of workday diaries found that the single strongest driver of good inner work life was the sense of making progress in meaningful work. Not recognition, not incentives. Progress, which suggests the essentialist strategy of minimal viable progress, asking what is the smallest step that would produce visible movement toward the essential thing, and taking it now rather than waiting for the conditions to be right. Momentum is a resource you manufacture, not one you wait to receive. Then Flow, by which McKeown mostly means routine. He argues that the point of a routine is to make the essential the default, so that doing the right thing costs no willpower at all, because willpower is scarce and decisions are expensive. He points to Michael Phelps's famously invariant pre-race ritual, a sequence so ingrained that when things went wrong in the water, he did not have to decide anything, he simply continued the tape that was already running. The insight is that discipline, in the long run, is not the ability to force yourself. It is the ability to design a life in which forcing yourself is unnecessary, because the essential thing has become the path of least resistance. And then Focus, which McKeown frames through the rugby coach Larry Jelwick's and the question he trained his players to ask, what is important now? Not what was important last week, which you cannot change. Not what will be important next month, which is not here yet. The past and the future are the two places our attention goes to hide from the present, and multitasking, McKeown notes, is not really the sin. You can multitask perfectly well, you do it all day. The sin is multi-focusing, trying to concentrate on two things at once, which is not difficult but impossible, and the attempt produces the specific modern sensation of being frantically busy and simultaneously absent. I want to be straight about this book's limits, because a summary that only sells is not worth your time. The most serious objection is one of power. Saying no gracefully is a great deal easier when you have standing, savings, and options. McKeown's readers are largely people who can afford to decline, and the advice lands very differently for someone on an hourly contract whose no gets them replaced. The book does not really engage with this. It presents a set of choices as universally available when they are, in practice, distributed according to leverage. The framework still has value at every level because even a constrained person has some margin and usually spends it badly, but the framing of I choose to becomes cruel if you extend it too far. Sometimes you genuinely have to, and being told otherwise by someone with a Stanford affiliation is not helpful. The second objection is about legibility. The 90% rule assumes you can score an option against a criterion you have already identified. But many of the most valuable things in a life were not identifiable as valuable in advance. The friendship that mattered started as an obligation. The career came from a side interest that would have scored a 40. Ruthlessly filtering for what you can currently recognize as essential is, in a certain light, a machine for eliminating serendipity. McKeown partly anticipates this, which is exactly why explore and play come before eliminate. But the tension is real, and readers who take only the filtering and skip the exploring will end up with a narrow, brittle life and a very tidy calendar. The third, gentler objection is that the ideas are not new and McKeown is a synthesist rather than an originator. Trade-offs are economics. The vital few is Pareto. Constraints are Goldratt. Routine is habit research. Progress is Amabile. What McKeown contributes is the assembly and the framing is genuinely valuable, but you should know you are reading a well-built house made largely from other people's bricks. If you keep only a handful of things from this book, I would keep these. Being overextended is a choice you are making by default, not a condition being imposed on you, and the first honest act is to stop describing your calendar as if it were weather. Success is self-undermining. The reward for doing one thing well is a flood of offers to do other things badly, and unless you supply the discipline that obscurity used to supply for free, that flood will take from you the exact thing that produced it. The danger is not the bad option. It is the pretty good one. Terrible offers get declined automatically. 60s and 70s are what actually fill a life, and if it is not a clear yes, treat it as a clear no. You cannot select the vital few without seeing the trivial many, so explore widely, play, sleep properly, and protect time in which you produce nothing. That time is not the reward for the work. It is where the work comes from. The past has no vote in what you do next. What you have already spent is gone regardless of whether you continue, and the only real question is whether this deserves your next hour. Subtraction is the skill, not addition. Anyone can add. Cutting is invisible, unrewarded, and it is the entire job. And boundaries do not appear on their own. Your unclaimed time is a free resource, and free resources always get consumed. Not out of malice. Out of physics. I want to end where McKeown began, in that hospital, with a man walking out to a meeting that did not matter. What makes that story stay with me is that he was not weak, and he was not stupid, and he was not being coerced. He was a thoughtful person who had studied this exact subject, and he still went, because in the moment the pull of not seeming uncommitted was stronger than his own clear knowledge of what mattered. Which tells you that this is not a problem you solve by understanding it. Understanding it is what he had. Understanding was not enough. So the honest version of this book's message is not that you should learn a framework. It is that you will be tested, quietly and constantly, in moments that never look like tests, by requests that are entirely reasonable, from people you like, and you will have about 4 seconds to answer. And in those 4 seconds, no framework will save you. What saves you is having decided in advance, in a calm moment, what your life is actually about, so specifically that you would know if you were living it and know if you were not. Most people never do that. Not because they are lazy, but because deciding means losing things, and we would all rather keep everything in a state of blurry potential than pick one thing and watch the others go. So we stay in the 60s and 70s, where nothing is ever wrong and nothing is ever really right, and we call it being busy, and we tell ourselves that after this next stretch it will get calmer. It will not get calmer. There is no future version of your life with more room in it, unless you make the room, and making it will feel exactly like loss, because it is loss. That is the price. Less, but better means less, actually less, real things you wanted, gone on purpose, so that a small number of things can finally get all of you. Which leaves one question, and it is the only one that matters. If your life shows what you chose, and not what you meant to choose, what is it showing right now? And if you do not like the answer, the good news is severe and simple. Nobody put it there but you. Which means nobody has to remove it but you.